I'm a big believer in second chances, even for people who commit serious crimes. Who deserves a second chance? Who gets one? And who decides? I'm Jessica Henry, and I'll be your host of Just Justice. I'm a former public defender, a professor of justice studies, and an award-winning author. And I'm excited for us to find new ways to put justice back into our criminal legal system. Welcome to Just Justice. Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming David Singleton. Professor David Singleton is the Associate Dean for Experiential and Clinical Programs at the University of the District of Columbia School of Law. He received his JD cum laude from Harvard Law School and his AB in Economics and Public Policy from Duke University. David has had a varied and storied career, starting as a Skadden Fellow at the Legal Action Center for the Homeless in New York City. He then worked as a public defender, first with the Neighborhood Defender Services of Harlem, and then with the Public Defender Service for the District of Columbia. He took on the role of the Executive Director of the Ohio Justice Policy Center in July 2002, where he worked for nearly 2 decades. Welcome to the show, David.
Jessica, I am so glad to be part of your podcast. It's a delight that you asked me, and I can't wait for our conversation.
Oh, me too. I'm so excited about this. David and I had the pleasure of serving together on a panel at the Second Look Network conference this year. And David's just such an impressive human, really inspiring. So I'm excited to have this discussion with you. And before we get into sort of what you're doing now, I'd like to take you all the way back because this is kind of a fascinating thing. You graduated from Harvard Law School, and that means you could have gone to work literally anywhere, doing anything. And you chose to work at the Legal Action Center for the Homeless in New York. And I'm wondering, how did that first work experience sort of shape your belief in second chances? How did you come to choose that job over any of the other opportunities that you were looking at? Could you just tell us about what was going on all the way back then?
So you want my origin story? My origin story in terms of why I wanted to do public service work. And really, I got to take you back to the summer of 1987. It was my summer after my junior year in college. And there was something called the Duke Homeless Project, which allowed me to spend that summer in New York City, helping homeless people. I basically lived in a shelter over the weekends and sort of coordinated some things for the men in the shelter. And that was very impactful, that experience. But the most impactful experience that summer was when I asked my mother to tell me the block that I was born on in the South Bronx. Because although I was born in the South Bronx, I only spent 6 months there. My family moved to Asheville, North Carolina. And I don't know if you've been to Asheville, but Asheville and the South Bronx could not be more different. And when I grew up, I was bored in Asheville. Asheville's a happening place now. But I was really bored as a kid. I was eager to get to a big city. And so on a beautiful summer day in 1987, I found my way up to the block. And I was just blown away by what I saw. I will never forget the broken glass on the sidewalk shimmering in the sunlight, the boarded up buildings on that block that I was born into, and young Black men about my age on the corners, probably engaged in drug dealing. I'm not sure of that, but that's what it looked like. And that was the moment where I was like, I got to go to law school and help people who I could have been. So that was sort of the origin story. And because I had spent that summer, working for the Partnership for the Homeless as part of this Duke Homeless Project, I was torn after graduation between doing legal services in that area or being a public defender. So I got this fellowship, the Skadden Fellowship, to work at the Legal Action Center for the Homeless. Loved that work. Helping people who were incredibly vulnerable was something that just totally shaped me, continued to shape me in terms of my outlook. Going into the Amtrak tunnels where people are living and trying to bring them, out of the darkness into the light and get them the legal services they need. I felt privileged to be able to do that. But then I got an opportunity to become a public defender, which really was born out of that trip to the South Bronx that afternoon. So that's my story in a nutshell in terms of why I went to law school knowing this was the kind of work I was going to do.
I mean, that's amazing. And, I practiced when I was a public defender. I was in the South Bronx. I was at the Bronx Defenders. So while I don't know the exact street you're talking about, I do know the area and the community that you sort of saw and thought, oh my goodness, I want to go back and serve the same people where I was first born. It's a really impoverished community and desperately in need of help from people who are willing to get up there and do the work. But you didn't work at the Bronx Defenders. I don't know when you started working. You worked at the Neighborhood Defender Services to start.
Neighborhood Defender Service of Harlem, yeah.
And then later on, you switched down to the District of Columbia, where you worked at PDS, Public Defender Services. I'm just wondering, so you go there, you're actualizing this vision that you had back in college. What did you see and experience as a public defender?
Well, let me say this first. I loved being a public defender. I loved it in the South Bronx. I loved it in Washington, D.C. The thing, though, that got me, and I'll never forget this just dread of going to the jail. I love to go see my clients. But the thing that bothered me was walking into the jail and in the waiting room, nothing but Black and brown people waiting to meet with their loved ones behind glass. Little kids with their mothers, grandmothers, aunts, waiting to see the male figure in their life, whether it was father figure, brother, uncle. And just the enormity of the racial disparity, which I knew about in sort of an academic way. I mean, yeah, I knew that. I know that Black and brown people are disproportionately scooped into our criminal legal system, but just to see it on a day-to-day basis started to take a toll on me. Now, I wanted to continue being a public defender when we moved to Ohio for my wife's work, but the system in Hamilton County, where Cincinnati is, was just so broken without the resources that you need to do that work well, that, combined with my desire to sort of work at a bigger picture level to address the issues of race and other unfairness and in a big picture way of our criminal legal system, it provided me an opportunity to step out of the role of representing people as a public defender in the trenches and do more policy work, more big picture thinking. But I love being a public defender, but it was not easy. It was hard work.
It's really hard work. And, for the folks who are listening who may not know, when David talks about working at the Neighborhood Defender Services or at the Public Defender Service for DC, those are two of the premier public defender offices in the country. And when I say premier, I don't mean that they're the best funded or they have a really different vision of what it means to do public defense. David, do you want to talk a little bit about what makes those offices perhaps unique or different than what you were seeing when you hit Ohio?
Not every public defender office is funded well. And I'm not saying that PDS or Neighborhood Defender Service were the best funded, but we were well funded. We had relatively low caseloads. Like when I was at Neighborhood Defender Service, I probably never had more than 24 cases at a time, which I know your mouth goes agape. I'm watching your mouth open widely. And when I was at PDS, it at least back in the 90s, maybe 30 cases. And some of your listeners may be thinking, well, that sounds like a lot of cases. No. That is a dream caseload. And what you can do in terms of being ready for trial, in terms of the investigation you need to do, it's just a world of difference from what a lot of public defenders face around the country. So I was blessed in that way to be able to work in an office that had the resources, had the investigation resources. We had the money we needed to hire experts without having to beg the court. So those things made a difference. And the training that we got, it's very similar to what you had at the Bronx Defenders. I mean, we didn't start taking cases until we had like 6 weeks of training. So you had very committed, client-centered lawyers that were both at Neighborhood Defender, at the Public Defender in DC, and also where you worked at the Bronx Defenders. It's really fortunate when you get to serve people in an office that is well run like that.
The idea of being client-centered is, again, something to me that's so obvious. Of course, you're client-centered, you're representing clients, but so many public defender offices just are overwhelmed, under-resourced, and don't have that philosophy driving their work. And I think, you coming out of those experiences, I think very much from what I know of your work in Ohio, really shaped sort of the vision that you brought with you. If you had to sort of look back on those years when you were a public defender, what was your major takeaways?
Well, in terms of the people that I was so honored to serve, the thing that struck me about every single individual was their humanity. And that gets lost in our debate and our discussion as a society about our criminal legal system. The worst sorts of adjectives are used to paint people who are somebody's son or daughter, mother, father, brother, sister. And just the humanity and the fact that we should never write people off. That's probably the biggest lesson that I took with me to Ohio, was this philosophy of never writing anybody off. And then, of course, in terms of the system we have, criminal legal system that if you are rich, if you are white, you are much more likely to come out of it unscathed, if you were even scooped into it in the first place, compared to if you are a poor person, and particularly a poor Black and brown person. But poor people get it rough in the criminal legal system. I had plenty of, white clients in Ohio who were screwed. The system is not one that anybody should want to be in. But, if you're a Black or brown person, you're going to be much more likely to get brought into it. So the unfairness of all of that is something that was a lesson that traveled with me to Ohio.
So when you got to Ohio, you shortly thereafter became the executive director of the Ohio Justice Policy Center, and you wound up working there for 20 years. And I know that you brought your client-centered vision to the work, and I know that you brought this never write anyone off philosophy to the work. And I'm wondering if you could tell us, what is that philosophy, and maybe let us know about the amazing work that the Ohio Justice Policy Center does.
When I started there in 2002, we basically just represented people who were in the Ohio prison system who had civil rights issues, like they were denied their, right to practice religion. They were beaten or sexually assaulted by staff or other incarcerated people. They were denied medical care. That's what the organization did when I got there. We expanded the mission a bit on my watch. We started these community legal clinics that helped folks who had criminal records deal with the numerous laws that made them second class or third class citizens. We have 1,000 laws in the state of Ohio that say you can't work in certain industries or field if you've got a criminal record. Of course, there's the issue of getting housing. There's, professional licenses and the like. So that was another piece of the work. And then we started this project in 2019 called Beyond Guilt, which is focused on getting people out of prison who are overpunished. And I don't mean innocent folks. I'm talking about folks who are not contesting their guilt. Maybe they did exactly what the government charged them with. Maybe they did a part of it, but they've been in for a long time. And I'm not talking about low-level, nonviolent drug crimes. I'm talking about people who were serving, long sentences for hurting someone, for killing someone, for sexually assaulting someone. And that's where that never write people off attitude and ethos really drove that work, because there are so many people who, in their worst moments, did bad things. I'm not going to call them mistakes because they were bad things, but that should not define forever who that person is. Of all the work that we did or that I was able to do while I was at OJPC, I probably am the proudest of Beyond Guilt, because it really allowed me to live out that dream and that spirit of never writing people off.
Can you tell us a little bit more than exactly what does that mean? So you've got somebody who's been sentenced to 1,000 years in prison or life plus 100 or whatever. And so what would you do for them to create opportunities for second chances? Like, what exactly were you doing?
Some of it was just making it up as we went along. The very first people we got released, I'll tell you about one, Angelo Robinson. Angelo had been convicted of a murder. He had served 22 years of a 29-year to life sentence. Basically, he, had been dealing drugs, had shot through a door when he thought that some folks were about to rob him. He was behind a door guarding some drugs, and he wound up killing his friend in the process and got charged with murder. He turned down a plea that would have allowed him to plead to manslaughter for 14 years and then wound up with a life sentence, 29 years to life. So he had exhausted all of his appeals. He had exhausted his post-conviction remedies. And we went to the prosecutor. And by the way, when I say we went to the prosecutor, I'm not talking about a progressive prosecutor. That does not really exist in Ohio, progressive prosecutors. And we can debate whether there is such a thing as progressive prosecutors. But there are prosecutors around the country, like Larry Krasner in Philadelphia, who really are trying to figure out ways to get people out of prison who don't belong there. But I sat with the elected prosecutor and said, we don't have a legal vehicle really to get Angelo out. How about I file a motion anyway for a new trial, even though we don't meet the standard? If you don't oppose it, or if you come to the judge with us and tell the judge you agree to it, maybe we can get the judge to just do it. And we came up with a theory. We came up with a theory for why the judge should do this. And with the prosecutor's support, the judge said, fine, I'm going to do it. And we got a number of people out that way. We have done traditional post-conviction work for folks where, the government hid evidence that would have helped the person, and the Constitution demands fairness, and that's not fair when you hide helpful evidence. And we've gotten some people out through new trial motions based on that. And we've also represented people in front of the parole board, which is always a fight to get people out through parole. But, we were able to get a number of people out. So it was a range of things. But that creative sort of, let's figure out, even if the law says, you're probably not supposed to do it this way, let's try and figure out some creative way to do it. And we were able to do that in a number of cases. I think now, since 2019, probably over 50 people have gotten out through Beyond Guilt. And that may seem like a drop in the bucket, but for those individual people, it matters. It just matters.
Gosh, yeah. I mean, that's an amazing thing. Of course, 50 people is a lot of people. And it's not just those people, it's their families and their communities who benefit from their return.
That's right.
But, I'm wondering, David, so you say you go to the prosecutor and, you present them with this idea. How does that work? Why are they on board with this? What do you present to them that they may say, oh, yeah, you're right. He shouldn't be sentenced to life, even though that's what we asked for?
Let me step back. The best thing that ever happened to me was coming to Ohio, where I had to get out of my comfort zone and figure out how to try and get progressive legal system reform work done with people who were not folks that I would have ever thought would be allies. And this particular prosecutor that I'm talking about is a guy named Joe Dieters, who's now on the Ohio Supreme Court. And Joe Dieters does, if you had central casting call for tough on crime prosecutor, Joe would fit the bill. He's pro death penalty. He's, sent a lot of people to death row. And we had a chance to meet once. We had a chance to do a reverse debate on the death penalty where I was supposed to argue for it, and he was supposed to argue against it. It was part of an effort to get people who disagree to talk to one another. And as part of that experience, we got to see that even though we disagreed on a lot, we actually had more in common than we thought we did. And after that reverse debate on the death penalty, we agreed to try and work together where we could. Joe was instrumental in helping us get an innocent person released, and he went to bat for her, even though he had to go against another prosecutor in a different part of the state. And then when we came up with this idea for Beyond Guilt, before we launched it officially, I was like, Joe, I'd like to launch this program. Will you be supportive of it for people who've been overpunished? He said, yes. The lesson there is we should not write people off. Now, usually when I say that, I'm talking to members of the community about why they shouldn't write the people that I represent off. But it also applies to those of us doing the work. We shouldn't write off people based on their politics. We should try to find ways to work together where we can, because you never know. Somebody might surprise you. And that's what happened with Joe Dieters. It's happened with a few other prosecutors in Ohio that have stepped up when we've asked them to step up and have found ways to be useful in freeing people who are overpunished. Sometimes we have to fight, and it's a battle, but where we can cooperate and work together, that's a beautiful thing.
Sure, it's a beautiful thing. And it makes it a little easier when you've got the prosecution on your team.
Oh, you ain't lying on that.
You are so thoughtful and big picture about the impact that you can have when you're doing this kind of work. And I'm wondering, how did your vision tie in with this phenomenon that we call mass incarceration in the United States? How did it tie in with the racism that is so evident in our criminal legal system? When you think about Beyond Guilt, how do you tie it to those concepts?
Well, part of how we thought about tying Beyond Guilt to the bigger issues of mass incarceration and racial inequity in the system was through storytelling that would lead to hopefully policy change. And so with the consent of our clients and active partnership with our clients, particularly the ones who were able to get released, we found creative ways to get their stories told. We partnered with local universities that had film departments that would have students come out and create short videos that could be used to help tell the story of why we shouldn't be over punishing people and locking people up for decades when they can be productive and in the community. That led to an exhibit at the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center in Cincinnati, and another one in Columbus at the Urban Art Space, where people from the public could come in and learn about this person, this human being who, they served time for murder, but there's so much more than that. And look at who they are now. And so, I'm not up to speed with what OJPC is doing on the policy front anymore, since I've tried to leave and not have a shadow. But I know that the goal of getting those stories told was to lay the groundwork for bigger reform. Getting 50 people out of prison, great, pat ourselves on the back for that. But what about the bigger lift that needs to happen? And that's not going to change until we change the dominant narrative of people who wind up in the criminal legal system. That dominant narrative is we should be locking up people and throwing away the key. And the storytelling that we were doing at OJPC, and I'm assuming they're still doing now, is to counteract that with stories of humanity and stories of injustice of people who are overpunished. And the vast majority of whom, that we were representing were people of color. Not all, but the vast majority. So that's how, at least at my time at OJPC, we envision linking the individual cases to the bigger issue of mass incarceration.
Yeah, and then storytelling, at the end of the day, is sort of everything, right? Because it's very easy to read about a horrific crime in the newspaper and then to write that person off as a not person, as a monster, as an other. And when we can tell stories that say, yes, that person did a terrible thing, but look at all these other amazing, extraordinary things, or just regular old good things that this person is doing. It really does shift the narrative. I think people just don't even pause to think about it. So stories are a really great way to capture that and very impactful. So I want to change gears if I can about a really terrific law review article that you called. I love this title. It's a little provocative, but I love it. You said, Restoring Humanity by Forgetting the Past. And I, of course, took a deep dive because I just thought that was a terrific title. And, this article sort of questions the idea of having criminal records and criminal histories. I mean, when you apply for a job, oftentimes, unless you're in a state that's gotten rid of the question, you've got to say, yes, I have a criminal history. And that can preclude you from getting a job, even getting through the job market or getting through a job interview. And so you sort of make the argument that we should be able to expunge a person's criminal record, not just as a practical way, but as a way of recognizing a person's individual humanity. And you had referenced previously, sort of how in Ohio, there's 1,000 different laws that preclude people from entering society. In the literature, we call those collateral consequences. You get punished for a crime, but then there's all these things that happen even if you have the opportunity to be released, even if you're given an official second chance. There's all these other things that happen that prevent you from really getting a full and fair second chance. And I'm wondering, could you just tell us a little bit about that article, what expungement is, and what was the impetus for what you wrote about?
Well, I'll take the last part of it first. The impetus was the people that I've been able to represent. All of the articles I've written are about human beings who have inspired me, human beings who I feel haven't been able to flourish in the ways that they want, even though in many respects they are flourishing, but there's still something that is holding them back. And the folks that I wrote about in that article were all really doing their best in trying to live the American dream. But this thing called a felony record was just dogging them. And one of the people I wrote about was Angela Robinson. He actually had a job. He was able to get a good job. So it's not always the case that you can't get a job. But he felt less human because of his record. And he just wanted to be, he's since passed away, sadly. He wanted to be fully free. And that meant fully free of all of the shame, all of the harsh looks he would get when people would learn about his criminal record. That took a piece of his soul. And that just shouldn't be. Most people who commit violent crimes, they're not going to do it again. It's something that happens once. Obviously, there are exceptions to that. But why should we define people forever by that thing that they did in Angela's case and the other cases that I wrote about decades before? So expungement is the process of erasing the criminal record. True expungement is, at least in Ohio, and this is probably true in other parts of the country as well, true expungement is incredibly rare. And that's when the record just completely gets eliminated. Most times when we're talking about record expungement, we're really talking about record sealing, which means that the record, it disappears from public view, but if you're applying for a sensitive job, there's a way to find out that the person has a criminal record. And, I've represented people over the years, for instance, who, despite getting record sealing, they can't work in a child daycare center because they happen to have a conviction that disqualifies them. They've been trained, they're good people, the issue is long in the past. And so expungement would say that record's just gone and nobody can ever look at it for any reason because it's just erased. I think we need more of that.
One of the interesting things, a lot of people are like, oh, well, if they can't work in a childcare setting, they must have done something, their crime must have been involving a child. But that's actually really not true. I remember in New York, people would get trained in prison to be barbers, but there was like this prohibition. You couldn't be a barber when you got out if you had a criminal record, which is wild. So there are all kinds of prohibitions that aren't linked to the type of offense, but that really can have a tremendous impact on what you can do for work and where you can work and who you can work with.
I had this one case once where a woman was cleaning her house, doing a spring cleaning, and she left the windows up on the upstairs of her house. She had young children that she was supervising downstairs. She had a seizure while she was on the phone, and her friend called 911. The ambulance came and got her. The police came, and they wound up charging her with endangering children because the window was up, but she was supervising her kids, but she had this seizure. And so she pled no contest, thinking, okay, that's fine. And then years later, the thing that she's really good at is helping children. And she has to get told, you can't work in this daycare anymore because you've got this criminal record. That makes no sense.
It doesn't make sense. And so tell me, so I commit a serious crime. Can I just get my record expunged? How do you do it?
So in Ohio, as well as most states, there are carve-outs for certain types of crimes. Like if you committed a murder, you're never going to get that expunged. It doesn't matter how rehabilitated you are. The record's never going to get sealed. But if you aren't barred by the type of offense, you have to apply to the sentencing court, the court that sentenced you, and the prosecutor has an opportunity to object. And in the lower level felony cases and misdemeanor cases, provided that the person's eligible, usually the judge in Ohio would grant it, occasionally not. But I just want the listeners to understand that there are certain people who will never be able to get their record sealed or expunged based on what the crime of conviction was.
Those people who do get their record expunged, that's another form of a second chance. Can you talk a little bit about that? Sort of what is that connection?
For somebody who gets, let's say they get their record sealed in Ohio and they apply for a job and it's not one of those sensitive jobs like being a police officer, they have a sense of freedom now because they know that the employer is not going to be able to find a conviction. They are legally entitled to say that they don't have any convictions that they have to report because the law says, if you've gotten it sealed, you don't have to answer that question that you've been convicted. It's a really good tool for people who want to be considered for good jobs that will pay them well and pay them a living wage. And even for people who don't need to get their record sealed for employment, again, it just makes them feel more human, makes them feel more connected, that they're not walking around with this badge of inferiority.
Yeah, and when you think about the number, literally millions of people who are carrying with them a criminal record and all of those collateral consequences that go along with them, it is stunning how many folks do not feel a full participant in our society.
That's right.
It's a really great article for anybody out there who's interested in taking a look at it. So, David, today, you've made this transition from advocate to a new associate dean for experiential and clinical programming at your law school in DC. And I'm wondering, you've devoted your whole life basically to second chances. If you really think about it, right? You've been representing folks who are marginalized, who didn't have anyone standing for them. And you've been trying to create narratives and tell stories about the humanity of people and advocating for them in all different and really creative ways. So tell me, what is your vision for this new role as associate dean? And how does it fit in with your long worldview of access to justice for all, for second chances, for dignity and humanity of people?
Well, I want to first say that I am so blessed to be at UDC's law school. It has one of the best clinical programs in the country. Its mission is to serve the community. It is very much public interest oriented school. It's an HBCU, and we have a statutory mandate through our clinics to provide legal services to residents of the District of Columbia. We've got immigration clinic, we've got criminal clinics, one representing people's public defender clinic and another post-conviction clinic. So those sort of are the two options in the criminal clinic. We've got general practice clinic, legislation clinic, a community development clinic. And so very, very public interest focused. Got amazing colleagues. And so we are working on refining what our vision is for the future. So that is not fully formed in terms of what may change over time. But one thing that I'd like to bring to UDC is this importance on storytelling. Again, with the people that we serve as full partners, and it's not just telling people stories without their permission. That's never okay. But harnessing those stories to drive bigger change in the District of Columbia is something that I would like to try and figure out with my colleagues how to do, because I saw that work well in Ohio. And I think we were just scratching the surface in Ohio with the storytelling aimed at driving policy change. And I'd like to see how we could do that here in our clinics. Because, one thing that I never knew, and I don't know, Jessica, if you were trained on this in law school, but I was never trained on how to think about using the media, for instance, to drive a story that would hopefully result in policy change. I had to learn that as part of the work I did in Ohio. Because when I was a public defender, we got told we don't talk to the press. And there's reasons for that, I suppose. But there is a tool. Lawyers have more than just the ability to go to court and fight it out there. I think that we can be useful in other ways in helping to build coalitions and helping to craft the media narrative. And I think that our students ought to be learning how to do that too, so that they can come out more fully formed as advocates and more well-rounded as advocates.
You're so right. The art of storytelling, I think, is part of law school, but the art of harnessing today's media is not. And it's such a critical part of the conversation. I mean, we have seen mass incarceration be the prevailing narrative, the tough on crime rhetoric that we've seen since the 70s. And the only way to combat that is by really introducing the stories. So I think it's going to be amazing. I can't wait to see what you do in your new role.
We haven't fully formed it yet, but we will see.
And then, David, to wrap up our conversation, which has been so wonderful, as I anticipated it would be, in Just Justice, we are talking all about second chances, and you are someone who has, as we said, devoted your life to this subject. But if you could just explain to the listener your final thoughts, like, why do you think fundamentally it is so important to provide people with the opportunity for second chances?
First, I would say we are all human beings on this planet, period. We are all human beings. We are all capable in the worst situation of doing the worst thing. And I would ask people to think about it this way. If you or a loved one were convicted of a serious crime, would you want to be thrown away? Would you want to, or either you or your loved one to be thrown away? Or would you want to have an opportunity to show that you are more than that bad thing? And I think that most of us get the concept of we should treat others the way we would want to be treated, the golden rule of sorts. And I think that when you look at it that way, and when you imagine being in the shoes of someone who was served 30 years in prison for something they did when they were a young person, if you were that person, would you want to never get released, never have an opportunity to show what you are capable of in terms of good? And then, the other piece of it is we lose out on so much talent and potential when we just slam the door of second chance in people's faces. People who have come home and can't work because of a law that was not well thought out that said you cannot own your own construction firm in such and such state if you've got a felony record, or you could be denied a barber's license because you've got a felony record. Do we really want to shut the door on people having a chance to thrive? Because I'll tell you what, most of the people, actually every single person who came to our legal clinics in Ohio who said, can you please help me get my record sealed? I want to find a job. They wanted to do it the right way. They wanted to be a productive tax-paying member of the community and not have to resort to some other way to support themselves. So it is in our interest to give second chances. It's something that we should want to see, because who knows, maybe we might one day be in a system that is put us behind bars. Everybody is capable of being swept into the system somehow, whether it's something they did or something that they didn't do that they got wrongly charged with. So I think that that's why second chances matter. We're all human beings.
Well, thank you so much to David Singleton for coming on the show. It was great to see you again. And thanks for sharing your thoughts about second chances and your work.
Thank you, Jessica, for having me.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Just Justice. If you like what you heard, please follow us wherever you listen to podcasts and tell a friend. To share an idea for the show or to stay in touch, head to jessicahenryjustice.com or find me on the socials at Jessica Henry Justice. See you next time.